When we picture a dictator or at least a man who wields absolute unquestioned power over a nation, there's a very specific expectation.
Right, there's an archetype.
Exactly. A certain archetype that instantly comes to mind. We imagine like the conquering general on a white horse, draped in military glory.
Someone whose power comes from just the brutal arithmetic of the battlefield.
Yeah, or, well, we picture a mesmerizing demagogue. Someone who whips crowds into a frenzy with this booming theatrical voice, manipulating mass psychology through massive public rallies.
But then you look at the man who was arguably the most powerful figure in 19th century Europe, and that entire archetype just shatters completely.
It really does. Imagine this. The man who bends an entire continent to his will, he doesn't rule by military glory. In fact, he actually faked an arm injury to try and dodge the draft when he was younger.
Yeah, and when he spoke in Parliament, it wasn't a roar at all. It wasn't the kind of voice that commands an amphitheater.
No, not at all.
He had a squeaky, surprisingly hesitant speaking voice. He would sort of rock back and forth at the podium, constantly pulling a handkerchief from his back pocket to wipe his brow.
Just looking almost nervous, right?
Very nervous.
And behind closed doors, if he didn't get his way, he wouldn't just, issue a cold execution order. He would throw these hysterical, tearful tantrums.
Oh, massive tantrums. He was a glutton, a huge hypochondriac, and technically, well, he was just a disposable civil servant.
Right. A guy who could be fired at any moment, yet he dominated kings, emperors, and generals. Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive.
Exactly.
Today, we are taking a massive stack of sources. Chief among them, Jonathan Steinberg's monumental biography, Bismarck, a life alongside contemporary diaries, sociological frameworks, and, historical analyses of 19th century Prussia.
It's a really comprehensive look at the era.
Yeah. And our goal is to uncover exactly how Otto von Bismarck manipulated monarchs, navigated violent revolutions, and unified Germany. Because he didn't do it through established institutions.
Or mass appeal, for that matter.
Right. He did it through the terrifying, magnetic power of his own personality, what Steinberg calls his sovereign self.
It's such a fascinating concept to unpack, because when you strip away the eventual titles and all the myth-making, Bismarck's power in those crucial early and middle years was, well, it was almost entirely psychological.
Yeah, he didn't have the backing of a modern political machine.
No, he just had himself.
Okay, so let's establish a framework for this. Imagine you work at a massive, incredibly cutthroat corporation. And there's this guy, let's call him the CEO, though technically he has zero equity in the company.
Right. No shares at all.
None. He holds no formal title of absolute authority. The board of directors could legally fire him at literally any second. And yet, he still completely controls the board, the shareholders, and the entire market simply by walking into the room.
It's not because they respect his legal right to govern them.
Exactly. It's because his sheer presence bends reality to his will. The force of his intellect and his capacity for rage make it impossible for anyone else to make a decision. That is Bismarck.
And it must have been an incredibly suffocating presence to be around.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
To really understand the mechanics of that dominance, we have to look at how the people ostensibly above him felt.
Yeah, the people who were supposed to be the bosses.
Right. We had this incredible admission from Emperor William I, the Kaiser of Germany, the man who was, on paper, Bismarck's absolute sovereign and boss.
The ultimate authority.
Yes. And the Kaiser actually complained to an associate. He said, it's hard to be Kaiser under Bismarck.
That dynamic is completely wild. The absolute monarch of the German Empire is complaining that his employee is too overbearing.
It's almost comical, really.
It is, but it begs a massive structural question. How does a person achieve that level of dominance without the legal or traditional framework to back it up? If the king can just fire him, why doesn't he?
Well, to understand the mechanics of why people obey, we really need to turn to Max Weber.
The sociologist, right?
Yes, one of the founders of modern sociology. Weber spent a lot of time analyzing the nature of power, and he famously identified three forms of authority, or what he called legitimations.
Okay.
These are essentially the underlying sociological reasons why human beings agree to obey the state or a leader.
Right. The classic three models of authority: traditional, legal, and charismatic.
Exactly. Let's define them quickly to see how Bismarck fits, or actually doesn't fit into them.
Okay, let's do it.
So the first is traditional authority. Weber called this the authority of the eternal yesterday.
The eternal yesterday. I like that phrasing.
It's very poetic. It's the patriarch, the prince, the feudal lord. You obey because this is the way things have always been, sanctioned by time and custom.
Makes sense, like a king ruling by divine right.
Right. Then the second is legal or rational authority. This is domination by virtue of legal statute, rationally created rules, and functional competence.
So like obeying a traffic cop. You obey him not because of his bloodline, but because the legal framework of the state empowers his badge.
Precisely. And the third, charismatic authority, is devotion to the extraordinary personal gift of grace of an individual.
The prophet or the warlord or the revolutionary leader.
Exactly. You obey because this specific person seems practically superhuman or divinely inspired. But looking at Bismarck's life, he seems to fundamentally break the rules of all three categories.
Yeah, he absolutely fractures the sociological models. I mean, he was a royal servant to the Hohenzollern dynasty, so you might assume he relied on traditional authority.
You would think so.
But he constantly subverted traditional hierarchies. He manipulated the king and openly mocked the older nobility when they disagreed with him.
Right, he had zero respect for tradition when it got in his way.
And he operated as a parliamentary minister, which implies legal authority. But he famously ignored laws, bypassed parliaments, and gets this collected taxes illegally for years when the legislature wouldn't pass his budgets.
He literally just ignored the legal framework, which leaves charismatic authority.
Okay.
But as we already established, he wasn't a demagogue.
No, he wasn't out there holding massive rallies or charming the working class.
He never even addressed a mass public meeting until after he was fired from power in his twilight years.
That's amazing. So if he is alienating the traditionalists, ignoring the legalists, and avoiding the masses, his power has to be rooted in something far more interpersonal.
It was rooted in sheer personal magnetism, deep psychological intimidation, and a bizarrely weaponized form of hypochondria.
Weaponized hypochondria?
Yeah. He commanded those around him so utterly that his contemporaries constantly used words like tyrant and dictator in their private diaries, long before those words had their modern 20th century connotations.
Wow.
He essentially governed by exhausting his opponents.
There's a quote from Prince Chlodwig von Hohenlohe that I think perfectly illustrates the physical weight of this man.
Oh, the sponge quote.
Yes. Hohenlohe was one of Bismarck's successors as chancellor, and he visited the government offices in Berlin a few months after Bismarck finally fell from power in 1890.
Right, after he was finally gone.
And Hohenlohe looked around and wrote, "I have noticed two things. First, that no one has any time. Secondly, that individuals seem to have grown larger."
Grown larger.
Yeah. He goes on to say, each separate personality is conscious of his own value. Formerly, the individual was oppressed and restricted by the dominant influence of Prince Bismarck, but now they have all swelled out like sponges placed in water.
Swelled out like sponges placed in water. It's such a visceral, brilliant image.
It really is.
It tells you that Bismarck's presence wasn't just politically dominant, it was physically and psychologically oppressive. He sucked the literal oxygen out of the room.
So when you were around him, your own personality had to shrink to accommodate the sheer size of his ego and his demands.
Exactly. And he demanded absolute, unquestioning perfection from his environment, to a degree that clearly borders on paranoia, or even madness.
Yeah, there is a deeply revealing anecdote from 1878 that the sources mention.
I know exactly the one you mean.
It's crazy. So Bismarck is at the absolute height of his fame and power. He has unified Germany. He is the master of Europe. He gives a speech in the Reichstag, the parliament.
Right.
And afterward, he literally flies into a hysterical, physically debilitating rage at the stenographers.
The shorthand typists, the people literally just transcribing the proceedings.
The humblest, most invisible clerks in the entire building. But Bismarck genuinely believed there was a deliberate, organized conspiracy among these low-level stenographers.
A conspiracy to do what, exactly?
To intentionally omit the crowd's applause and cheers from the official printed record of his speeches.
That is just incredible.
And he was so enraged by this perceived slight that he told his aide it was making him physically ill. He described his symptoms, saying the conspiracy gave him a stuffiness in the head, giddiness, a disposition to vomit.
A disposition to vomit over stenographers. What's vital to pull from that anecdote is the sheer fragile scale of his ego and how it directly tied to his physical health.
Yeah, the mind-body connection there is wild.
Could a sane, secure man truly believe that a handful of working-class clerks were organizing a covert operation to undermine the greatest statesman of the 19th century?
Probably not.
It shows you that his hypochondria and his need for absolute control were completely intertwined. When reality didn't perfectly reflect his own supreme self-image, His body physically revolted.
And he used these illnesses, the giddiness, the vomiting, the nervous breakdowns, as a literal weapon.
Absolutely. If a minister or a king defied him, Bismarck would literally take to his bed, weep, and threaten to resign, claiming their defiance was killing him.
It's the ultimate toxic workplace dynamic just scaled up to the level of an empire.
Exactly.
But this intense, overbearing ego and his complete disregard for established rules made him a lot of enemies, especially among the people who you'd naturally assume would be his closest allies.
The Prussian military elite.
Yes. They absolutely loathed him.
And the feeling was mutual. The aristocratic military men of Prussia prided themselves on authentic service, on physical courage, battle scars, and rigid, unquestioning discipline.
And Bismarck had exactly none of that.
None. Lieutenant Colonel Bronsart von Schellendorf, a highly respected officer on the general staff, kept a diary during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870.
Okay.
He constantly vented about Bismarck. He called him the civil servant in the cuirassier jacket.
Ouch. That's a very specific burn.
Right. He added that Bismarck was becoming more impudent every day. And later, as Bismarck's tantrums escalated, Schellendorf wrote, Bismarck begins really to be ready for the madhouse.
Okay, I have to stop here and unpack this visual because this feels like a massive contradiction.
How so?
Well, if the actual combat veterans hated him and they all knew he was basically a civilian politician who faked a muscle injury to get out of the mandatory draft in his 20s, why does he insist on wearing a military uniform everywhere?
It's a great question.
The sources specifically note he constantly wore this yellow-collared cuirassier uniform. First of all, what exactly is a cuirassier? And second, why invite the mockery of the real generals by cosplaying as one of them?
So cuirassier was a type of heavy cavalry. These are the shock troops in the 19th century. Men who rode massive horses and often still wore heavy breastplates cuirasses into battle.
So it's a very macho, aggressive branch of the military.
Very. It was associated with raw physical power, elite aristocratic status, and brute force charges.
And Bismarck is just a guy writing letters at a desk.
Exactly. For a bureaucrat who spent his days writing diplomatic cables to dress up as a heavy cavalryman was, to the actual generals, profoundly offensive. It was stolen valor.
So why do it? Why not just wear a very nice civilian suit like a British prime minister would?
Because Bismarck understood the deep underlying psychology of the society he was operating in. The uniform wasn't a fashion choice. It was a non-negotiable political necessity.
Really? A necessity?
Yes. In the Prussia Bismarck lived in, civilian clothes simply commanded no respect. Power, prestige, and legitimacy were entirely, inextricably tied to military service.
Wow.
To command the room, especially when he was dealing with foreign courts like St. Petersburg or the military attachés in Paris, Bismarck needed the visual weight of the uniform.
He needed the epaulets, the spurs, the imposing silhouette of a cavalry officer.
Precisely. Even if the actual generals whispered behind his back that he was a fraud, the visual symbol of the uniform was the only currency of power that truly registered in the Prussian mind.
That makes perfect sense. He is basically hacking the cultural software of his own country.
That's a great way to put it.
He recognizes that the military aesthetic is the ultimate cheat code for authority, so he adopts the visual language of the dominant culture to force them to take him seriously, regardless of his actual resume.
Exactly. But to truly understand why a heavy cavalry uniform was the only currency that mattered, we have to look at the very specific soil Bismarck grew out of.
Right. This militaristic software wasn't accidental. It was baked into the geography of the place.
Geography is destiny, as they say. We have to understand the world of the Prussian Junker. And you're right to point to the soil because the landscape of Prussia dictated its entire culture.
Okay, let's set the scene.
Bismarck was born in 1815 in the Mark of Brandenburg, a region east of Berlin. And the geography here is not the lush, rolling, fertile hills of France or the rich agricultural heartlands of England.
Far from it. The Mark of Brandenburg is famously described as flat, sandy, and full of bogs.
It was a landscape so poor, so fundamentally unpromising, that in many areas even trees struggled to take root.
That sounds miserable.
It was notoriously monotonous and bleak.
So the obvious historical question is, how does a sandy, treeless bog become the core of the most terrifyingly efficient European military kingdom and eventually the powerhouse of the German Empire?
It comes down to a sheer, almost unnatural triumph of human organization over geography. The Hohenzollern dynasty, and particularly Frederick the Great in the 18th century, realized that their land was too poor to make them rich, and their borders were too exposed to keep them safe.
Because they were surrounded by massive empires, right? Russia, Austria, France.
Exactly. To survive, Frederick the Great transformed this barren land into a highly regimented, militaristic superpower through sheer, unrelenting willpower. He established a standing army that was massive relative to the size of the civilian population.
There's that old saying that other states have armies, but the Prussian army has a state.
Exactly. In Prussia, the army didn't serve the state. The state existed to feed and supply the army.
And this is where Bismarck's specific social class comes into play, the Junkers.
Right. Junker essentially translates to young lord. They were the landed nobility of these eastern Prussian provinces, and Frederick the Great struck a very specific social contract with them.
What was the deal?
He essentially told the Junkers, "You'll have an absolute monopoly on all high-ranking officer commissions in the army and all top administrative posts in the state. In return, your estates, your wealth, and your actual bodily lives belong entirely to the crown."
So it was a service nobility.
Yes. They were defined not by decadent luxury like the French aristocracy at Versailles, but by their sacrifice and their stoicism.
And that sacrifice was staggering. The sources highlight this genuine blood tax. During the 7 Years' War in the 1750s and 60s, just one prominent Junker family, the von Kleists, lost 30 male members in battle.
30 members of one extended family wiped out in a single conflict.
That is unimaginable today.
It really is. When your social class pays that kind of price for the survival of the state, it breeds a culture that is incredibly tight-knit, fiercely proud, and obsessively focused on duty.
It makes me think of modern, ultra-exclusive networks like Ivy League legacy families or elite Wall Street fraternities, but entirely stripped of the focus on making money and replaced with live ammunition and existential stakes.
That's a really sharp analogy.
In this world, your worth isn't your bank account, it's your regiment.
Yes. And the sources highlight a brilliantly telling scene from a 19th century novel by Theodor Fontane called Irrungen Wirrungen that perfectly captures this exact Junker mindset.
Oh, the restaurant scene.
Right. It takes place at a nice restaurant in Berlin. It's a wonderful vignette for understanding the psychology we're dealing with. You have these two young Junker lieutenants, Botho and Wedel, who are meeting Botho's old uncle, Baron Austen, for a meal.
And the uncle is this fierce, traditional, old-school Prussian patriarch. He hates modern city life, he hates relaxed standards, and he demands absolute, unyielding respect.
Right, and the uncle is absolutely furious that these two young men are 1 minute late. One single minute.
He is dressing them down, practically questioning their honor over 60 seconds.
Exactly, but then the tension instantly evaporates the second he asks Wedel what regiment he serves in.
Right, and Wedel replies that he is in the Dragoon Guards.
And suddenly, the uncle is all smiles. He forgives them completely. In this society, the only question that truly mattered when meeting another human being was, where did he serve?
And lateness wasn't just considered a mild social faux pas. It was a moral failing, a breach of military discipline.
That exact military rigidity permeated every aspect of their lives. And we actually have Bismarck's own explicit view of this culture.
What did he say about it?
Later in life, he described the elite 1st Foot Guards Regiment, which was the pinnacle of Junker pride, as a military monastery.
A monastery. That implies a total devotion, shutting out the rest of the world.
Exactly. He said the esprit de corps among the officers bordered on sheer madness. He even warned that any woman who married an officer in that regiment would find herself as a wife driven to death through the service.
Because the regiment is the primary spouse? The state is the only family that matters?
Exactly. It is an all-consuming, intensely masculine identity where women, domestic life, and personal comfort played absolutely no role in the core value system.
It sounds like a harsh, unyielding world. And crucially, it was a world that felt deeply, existentially threatened as the 19th century began to unfold.
Extremely threatened. If the 18th century was the golden age of the Junker, the turn of the 19th century was their apocalypse.
Because of the French Revolution, right?
Yes. The French Revolution of 1789 had exploded the old feudal order. The idea that kings and nobles ruled by divine right was literally taken to the guillotine.
Yeah, that tends to send a pretty clear message.
And then Napoleon Bonaparte marched his citizen armies across Europe, spreading the contagion of these ideas. Equality before the law, civil rights, and the absolute dismantling of aristocratic privilege.
And the ultimate humiliation for the Junkers wasn't just ideological, it was military. The Prussian army, the untouchable machine built by Frederick the Great, the sole source of Junker pride, was utterly crushed by Napoleon at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt in 1806.
That defeat shattered their worldview. The Junkers were suddenly terrified. Their land, their status, their monopoly on power, and their very way of life were under siege by these modernizing, liberal, revolutionary forces from the West.
So they realized that just practicing military drill wasn't enough anymore.
Right. To survive in the 19th century, they needed a defense for their existence. They needed an ideology.
And this is where the history takes a fascinating transatlantic turn, because these rural, militaristic Prussian nobles found their intellectual savior in a very unlikely place.
An Irish-born British political thinker named Edmund Burke.
Yes, which is so strange to think about.
It is. Burke is widely considered the philosophical father of modern conservatism. When the French Revolution first broke out, and many intellectuals in Europe were cheering for it, Burke wrote a massive prophetic warning called Reflections on the Revolution in France.
And he argued vehemently against radical rapid change.
Yes. His core premise was that society is a complex, fragile organism. If you arrogantly tear down traditional institutions, the monarchy, the church, the aristocracy, in the name of abstract theories like liberty or equality, you won't get utopia. You will get chaos, bloodshed, and eventually a military dictatorship.
Which, spoiler alert for the French Revolution, is exactly what happened with the Reign of Terror and then Napoleon.
Exactly. So Burke defends tradition, but he also specifically warned against the moneyed interest. He argued that the rise of liquid capital, speculators, and free markets would destroy the stability of landed property, which he saw as the bedrock of a healthy society.
Okay, but how exactly does an English political treatise about France become the foundational Bible for Prussian Junkers who barely speak English?
It happens through the mechanics of translation, and specifically through a brilliant, highly opportunistic Prussian civil servant named Friedrich Gentz.
What did Gentz do?
Gentz was sharp. He saw that Burke's book was becoming a massive intellectual bestseller across Europe, so he took it upon himself to translate it into German in 1793. But Gentz didn't just translate it, he aggressively adapted it.
He remixed it.
Yes. He twisted Burke's classical, somewhat moderate British conservatism, which still respected Parliament and constitutional limits, into something much darker and much more reactionary. He essentially weaponized Burke's fear of rapid change, specifically for the Prussian aristocracy.
So he strips out the British parliamentary nuance and cranks the anti-revolutionary pro-aristocracy dials up to 11.
Exactly. And this is where we have to trace a very specific, very dark ideological lineage that Jonathan Steinberg's biography meticulously documents.
Right. We have to look at how this Burkean fear of liquid capital and modern free markets morphed into a virulent, deeply rooted anti-Semitism among the younger class.
Yes, the historical text is very clear on this progression. We can look at a specific, highly influential petition written in 1811 by a prominent Junker named Ludwig von Marwitz.
What was the petition about?
Marwitz was leading a protest against a proposed state decree that would grant Jewish people the right to own rural land in Prussia. Up until this point, Jews were largely restricted to urban areas and commercial trades.
And Marwitz's argument against this reform was deeply steeped in that twisted Burkean ideology Gentz had popularized.
Exactly. Marwitz argued that Jewish people inherently represented liquid capital, financial speculation, and the modern market economy. He believed that allowing them to buy land would destroy the traditional, stable, centuries-old bond between the Junker lord and his peasant workers.
The language Marwitz used in this 1811 petition is chillingly prophetic.
It really is. He argued that giving Jews the right to own estates would inevitably turn their venerable traditional Brandenburg Prussia into a Jew state. And he literally used the specific German term, Judenstaat. He claimed that if the agricultural markets fluctuated and the value of land dropped, as it naturally does in a free market, the old noble families would go bankrupt, the land will end in their hands, and the Jewish population would become the chief representatives and hidden rulers of the state.
Just to pause here, as we unpack this historical text, it is crucial to recognize how this establishes a very specific ideological mechanism.
Absolutely.
This 1811 petition isn't just an isolated prejudiced rant. It lays the exact groundwork for a conspiracy theory that would plague Germany for the next century and a half.
Yes, the Junkers are taking their fear of modernizing forces, liberalism, free markets, the loss of feudal privilege, and projecting all of that anxiety onto the Jewish population.
They are equating the frightening complexity of modern capitalism with a foreign ethnic threat to traditional German soil.
Precisely. The text traces this as a foundational intellectual pillar of the Junker worldview. This anti-modern, anti-Semitic framework, the belief that liberal capitalism is inherently destructive to the authentic rural German spirit, would fester and grow throughout the 19th century.
It is the very same ideological soil that long after Bismarck was gone would ultimately contribute to the cultural collapse of the Weimar Republic and facilitate the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s.
It is a heavy, undeniable, and deeply paranoid inheritance. And this is the water Bismarck is swimming in. He's born into a class that is intensely militaristic, fiercely proud, but fundamentally terrified of the modern world and deeply prejudiced against anyone outside their rigid social order.
But here's the fascinating twist that Steinberg's biography hinges on. Bismarck inherited this exact worldview. He absorbed its prejudices and its arrogance, but he did not perfectly fit the mold of the dutiful, selfless junker.
No, he did not.
He was far too individualistic, far too cynical, and far too erratic to just quietly serve in a cavalry regiment and die for the king.
Exactly. To understand why he was so chaotic, why he couldn't just be a normal, boring Junker aristocrat, we have to pull the camera back from the broad sweep of Prussian macro history and zoom into the deeply dysfunctional microenvironment of his childhood home.
Right. We have to look at his parents, because the clash between his mother and father perfectly explains the psychological engine of the sovereign self he eventually developed.
Bismarck was born to Ferdinand von Bismarck and Wilhelmine Mencken. And as a couple, they were a study in extreme opposites.
How so?
They could not have been more mismatched in temperament or background. Ferdinand, his father, was the quintessential amiable Junker country squire. He was weak-willed, mildly eccentric, entirely unintellectual, and perfectly content with a quiet rural life.
The sources mention a very specific detail about Ferdinand that I love because it paints such a clear picture of a guy with absolutely zero grand ambitions.
Oh, the thermometers.
Yes. He was obsessed with his thermometers. He had 4 of them hanging around the estate, and his daily routine consisted of walking around, tapping the glass on each thermometer, and noting the temperature.
That was his big daily task.
He treated his rural estate like a tiny, perfectly comfortable feudal kingdom where nothing important ever had to happen.
He was a nice man who wanted to be left alone. But Wilhelmine, Bismarck's mother, is a completely different story. She is a truly fascinating, formidable figure.
Tell us about her.
Wilhelmine Mencken was not a Junker. She was an urban commoner from Berlin, but she came from a brilliant, highly educated, bureaucratic elite family. Her own father had been a top royal cabinet counselor, essentially a highly powerful civil servant who worked directly with the king.
But her father died when Wilhelmine was young, right?
Yes. And in the social mechanics of the time, she needed to secure her future, so she married Ferdinand. She married an older, far less educated, entirely unambitious country squire, and she moved out to his rural estate.
And she was completely, utterly miserable.
Completely. She was cold, she was highly intelligent, she thrived on political gossip and urban culture, and she found rural Junker life suffocating.
And as often happens in marriages defined by frustrated ambition, Wilhelmine projected all of her unfulfilled desires onto her children, specifically young Otto.
Right. She wanted him to be the brilliant, educated, powerful spaceman that her father had been. She didn't want him to be a provincial farmer tapping thermometers.
So she took drastic action to ensure his education. When Bismarck is just 6 years old, she rips him out of the rural estate and ships him off to a boarding school in Berlin called the Playman Institute.
And based on the letters and memoirs, this place sounds like an absolute Dickensian nightmare, but with Prussian military characteristics.
This sounds horrific.
Bismarck considered his time at the Playman Institute a profound, formative trauma. The school was run on bizarre, Spartan physical conditioning principles. Bismarck later claimed in his memoirs that he was woken up in the freezing mornings not by an alarm clock or a gentle bell, but by teachers striking the boys with iron rapier blows that left physical bruises.
Getting hit with swords at 6 years old just to wake up.
Yeah, and he complained bitterly that the food was atrocious. He specifically, vividly remembered being forced to eat chewy, inedible meat.
You can imagine the psychological impact on a 6-year-old boy. You're taken from a massive, comfortable country estate with a kind, easygoing father and dumped into a freezing urban boarding school where men hit you with swords to wake you up.
And he blamed his mother entirely. He felt she'd abandoned him out of convenience and cold ambition.
And he carried that resentment for his entire life. It really formed the core of his emotional architecture.
He actually confessed his true feelings about his parents in a remarkably blunt letter to his future wife, Johanna.
What did he say?
He wrote about his mother. As a small child, I hated her. Later, I successfully deceived her with falsehoods.
That is so cold.
It gets better. Contrasting that, he wrote about his father. I really loved my father, but inwardly I felt hard and unloving because of his apparent weakness.
It is a devastatingly honest psychological confession. He actively hated the strong, brilliant, ambitious mother who abandoned him, and he genuinely loved the weak, kind father. But he fundamentally despised him for that very weakness, for not protecting him from the mother.
It's a textbook psychological complex.
Exactly. It seems like he spent his entire life searching for a strong father figure he could actually respect and obey, while simultaneously fighting a vicious, lifelong war against any strong, intelligent women who reminded him of his cold, domineering mother.
That psychoanalytical reading is exactly the framework Jonathan Steinberg uses to interpret Bismarck's later political behavior. Because if you look at the architecture of his power in the second half of his life, Bismarck essentially recreates this exact, unresolved childhood dynamic on the world stage.
He builds what historians sometimes call the royal triangle.
Right.
So who plays the roles of the parents in this geopolitical recreation?
Well, the surrogate father figure becomes Emperor William I. When William took the throne, he was an older, deeply conservative, kindly but fundamentally weak-willed man.
The perfect Ferdinand stand-in.
Exactly. Bismarck bonded with him intensely. He essentially treated the emperor as the father he wished he had, one he could respect because of his royal title, but crucially, one he could utterly manipulate, scold, and dominate through his tearful tantrums and constant threats of resignation.
So he finally gets a father he can control. And who is the mother figure he has to fight?
That role is filled by Empress Augusta, the emperor's wife.
Huh.
She was a highly educated, strong-willed, liberal-leaning woman who had her own political opinions, and Bismarck harbored a violent, frankly misogynistic hatred for her.
Because she threatened his control.
Yes. He was convinced she was constantly whispering in the emperor's ear, trying to turn his father against him. And later in his career, he directed that exact same venom at Princess Victoria, the British-born crown princess.
He viewed these intelligent, politically active women as meddling, domineering threats. The psychological parallel to his mother, Wilhelmine, is almost too perfect to ignore.
It really is striking. And this massive internal chaos, this deep psychic wounds of feeling abandoned and needing to assert absolute control, it didn't just manifest in his foreign policy or his hatred of the empress.
Right. It manifested in his physical body. The man's appetites and his bodily dysfunctions were legendary and frankly grotesque. It's like his body was trying to physically process the massive stress of his ego.
Yes, his gluttony was astounding, even by the heavy eating standards of the 19th century. Our historical sources describe typical dinners where Bismarck would sit down and eat an entire half of a turkey by himself.
Stuffed turkey.
Yes, and he would wash that immense amount of food down with a quarter to a half bottle of strong cognac, which he would mix with mineral water.
Half a turkey and a bottle of cognac. That's not a celebration feast. That's just a random Tuesday dinner for him. It is consumption on a scale that suggests a deep, unfillable emotional void.
And naturally, you cannot subject a human body to that kind of stress, combined with the stress of running a continent without severe consequences.
Yeah, his health was a constant rolling disaster.
He suffered from crippling insomnia, facial neuralgia, which is agonizing nerve pain in the face, and profound, debilitating hypochondria. By the 1880s, his condition was so bad he was put under the strict care of a physician named Dr. Schwenninger.
And the detail of how Dr. Schwenninger treated the great Iron Chancellor is incredibly poignant. How did he deal with Bismarck's insomnia?
Schwenninger realized that medicine wasn't the answer. Psychology was. To get Bismarck to sleep, the doctor would wrap this giant, imposing man in warm, damp towels.
Just wrapping him up tightly.
Yeah, and then Schwenninger would sit by his bed, literally holding Bismarck's hand in the dark, speaking to him softly until the Chancellor finally fell asleep.
It is such a striking, almost heartbreaking image. The most feared man in Europe, the architect of wars and empires, needing another grown man to hold his hand in the dark just to calm his mind.
It is powerful.
It is impossible not to see that as the terrified 6-year-old boy from the Plehman Institute, desperately searching for the motherly warmth and comfort he was denied.
Absolutely. It reveals that the sovereign self, this towering dictatorial persona that cowed generals and kings, was a fortress built over a very fragile, deeply damaged core.
Wow.
But it's important to remember that before Bismarck learned to channel this massive internal chaos into statecraft, diplomacy, and the unification of Germany, it exploited outward during his youth in incredibly destructive ways.
Which brings us to the era of his life that is often referred to as the Mad Junker phase. Because in his 20s, Bismarck was completely disastrously unmoored. He has this massive engine of a brain, but no track to run it on.
He was highly intelligent, he passed his exams easily, but he had absolutely no direction and a deep contempt for authority.
So what does he do?
He goes to university at Göttingen, ostensibly to study law, and he immediately rebels against the entire academic and social system. He adopts a wildly chaotic wardrobe.
Like what?
He wanders around in colorful, mismatched coats, refusing to wear a cravat, sporting huge, clanking cavalry spurs. And he parades around the university town with a giant, terrifying dog on a leash.
He's basically acting like a 19th century punk rocker, but with deadly weapons.
Pretty much.
Because he wasn't just dressing weirdly, he was fighting constantly. The university records show he engaged in 25 sword duels in just his first 3 semesters.
It was a reign of terror among the student body. And we actually get a vivid, first-hand fictionalized picture of this time from an American friend of his who studied with him, John Lothrop Motley.
And Motley later became a famous historian and diplomat, right?
Yes, but he wrote a novel called Morton's Hope, and he based one of the main characters, Otto von Bismarck, directly on the teenage Bismarck.
And the stories Motley includes in this novel are wild because they show the early mechanics of how Bismarck learned to dominate people.
Right, the early manipulation tactics.
At 18 years old, the Bismarck character decides he wants to be the undisputed leader of a prominent student fraternity. So to gain dominance, he intentionally and systematically insults everyone in the room. He challenges the senior, most respected member to a duel and intentionally slices off the tip of the guy's nose.
Just to assert dominance.
Yes. In another scene, he literally forces another student to jump over his walking stick like a trained dog.
What Motley recognized, even when they were teenagers, was that this savage behavior wasn't just mindless aggression. It was highly calculating.
How so?
In the novel, the Bismarck character explicitly tells Motley's character, "I see that this is the way to obtain superiority. I intend to lead my companions here, as I intend to lead them in afterlife."
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He realized early on that extreme, unpredictable, and savage behavior short-circuited normal social rules and deeply cowed most people.
He figures out that if you are willing to escalate a situation further than anyone else is comfortable with, you win by default. But this extreme bravado was masking deep insecurities. And that insecurity becomes painfully, embarrassingly obvious when he finally leaves university and tries to enter the adult world.
The Aachen incident.
Yes. He gets a job in the civil service in the resort town of Aachen, and it is a complete disaster.
Aachen was a famous spa town very close to the western borders, and it was a magnet for the international ultra-rich, particularly the British aristocracy.
Right.
So young Bismarck, a junior government clerk, arrives in Aachen and immediately abandons his desk job to fall in with a crowd of insanely wealthy English tourists, specifically the social circle surrounding the Duke of Cleveland.
To understand why this was such a disaster, we have to look at the wealth gap here, because it is almost comical. We think of Bismarck as a noble junker, so we assume he's rich.
The Prussian nobles were land rich and cash poor.
Right. So how big was the financial disparity?
It was staggering.
Yeah.
A top-tier, highly successful Prussian government official at that time might make a salary of around 21,000 thalers a year. Bismarck, as a junior clerk, made a fraction of that. The Duke of Cleveland, on the other hand, had a realizable fortune of over 21 million thalers.
Wow. So Bismarck is essentially a mid-level bureaucrat trying to hang out with billionaires. It's like a modern government worker taking out predatory loans to rent yachts in Monaco just to keep up with tech billionaires on Instagram.
That is exactly what he was doing.
He is drinking expensive champagne, gambling heavily, and pouring money he absolutely does not have down the drain just to stay in this social circle.
And he does it because he falls in love with the Duke's beautiful niece, Laura Russell. He convinces himself he's going to marry into this massive, aristocratic British fortune.
He pursues her relentlessly, ignoring his job completely, until he discovers a fatal flaw in the plan.
Right, he finds out that Laura Russell is illegitimate. Her mother had not always been a duchess.
And for a Prussian junker obsessed with bloodlines and social standing, this was a disaster.
Bismarck immediately panics about how this would look to his peers back home, abruptly dumps her, and is suddenly left completely alone, staring at a mountain of gambling and lifestyle debt.
Yeah. And he spirals completely. The historical letters show he was so deeply humiliated and desperate about his debts that he wrote to his brother talking about suicide. He specifically claimed he had procured a yellow silk cord for the purpose of hanging himself.
It is incredibly dramatic. The melodrama is intense.
But the truly amazing part is that he learns absolutely nothing from this near-death experience of his career and finances.
No, a few months later, he literally repeats the exact same mistake.
Are you serious?
Yes. He falls obsessively for another beautiful, wealthy English woman named Isabella Lorraine Smith. He abandons his post again, racks up even more debt following her family around Europe, and eventually bails on that engagement too when reality sets in.
So wait, let me summarize this, because the contrast with his historical legend is stunning. The guy who eventually masterminds the complex diplomatic web of the German Empire, the cold, calculating architect of European realpolitik, he basically washed out of his first career in his 20s because he was trying to keep up with the Joneses at luxury spas, maxed out his credit cards, and got dumped by 2 different tourists.
That is exactly the reality of his early 20s. He was a massive, embarrassing failure. He had abused his patron's goodwill, he was absent from his government desk for months at a time, and he was completely broke.
It's unbelievable.
He was so disgraced that he actually faked an illness to get out of his mandatory military service, fled his creditors, and retreated in total defeat to his family's Pomeranian estate, Nefoff.
He slinks back to the sandy bogs, and what does he do there?
Well, he earns the local nickname, the Mad Junker. He manages the agricultural estate, but he is suffocating from intellectual boredom. He drinks heavily, rides his horses like a maniac through the woods at night, and terrorizes his neighbors.
Terrorizes them how?
There is a famous documented story from this time where some guests were staying over at his house, and they locked their bedroom door so they could sleep in. Bismarck wanted them awake, so he went outside at 6:30 in the morning and fired 2 live pistol shots directly through their bedroom window to shatter the glass and wake them up.
Firing live ammunition into your friend's bedroom because you are bored. It is genuinely unhinged behavior.
He's a genius trapped in a rural cage, dying of understimulation. He desperately needed a profound anchor to stabilize his life.
And according to the historical timeline, he found that anchor in the most unexpected, counterintuitive place for a cynical, violent man.
Yes, he found it in a radical, fundamentalist Christian cult and through a deeply tragic love story.
Let's trace how this happens. Bismarck is bored out of his mind in Pomerania, so he starts hanging out with a local network of aristocratic neighbors known as the Pietists.
They were sometimes jokingly referred to by outsiders as the Makeover, or Maybugs.
What exactly was a Pietist in 19th century Prussia?
The Pietist movement was an intense evangelical born-again sect within the Prussian Lutheran Church, very popular among the rural nobility.
Okay, so a very devout group.
Yes. They completely rejected the rationalism and cold logic of the Enlightenment. They believed in a deeply personal, highly emotional, almost mystical connection to Jesus Christ. They held private prayer meetings, read scripture intensely, and believed in sudden, emotional conversion experiences.
And crucially for Bismarck's future, they were not just a religious group. They were a fiercely conservative political network closely connected to the inner circle of the Prussian king.
Yes. But Bismarck, the cynical, hard-drinking duelist, didn't start attending their prayer meetings because he was suddenly interested in theology. He was drawn into the circle by a specific woman named Marie von Thadden.
Tell us about Marie.
Marie was a remarkable woman. She was brilliant, deeply pious, highly charismatic, and she was already engaged to Bismarck's childhood friend, Moritz von Blankenberg.
But when she met the wild, chaotic Bismarck, she wasn't intimidated by him.
Not at all. She saw right through the mad Junker facade. She wrote in a letter that beneath his arrogant exterior, she saw his bottomless boredom and emptiness. She saw a soul in agony.
And Bismarck falls completely, hopelessly, intellectually in love with her. They form this intense, emotionally charged friendship.
There is an incredible historical anecdote that Steinberg highlights, where a small group of them are reading Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet out loud in a parlor.
Oh, this is a great story.
Bismarck is cast to read the part of Romeo, and Marie is reading Juliet. And as they read, the lines begin to blur completely between the fiction of the play and the reality of their forbidden attraction.
Marie actually wrote to a friend about this reading, noting how deeply connected she felt to him, while delicately adding that they skipped over the indecent parts.
It was a profound meeting of the minds, emotional connection. But Marie was honorable, and she married his friend Moritz as planned.
Bismarck respected the marriage but stayed close to the couple. And then sudden devastating tragedy strikes. In November 1846, Marie contracts a sudden illness and dies. She was only 24 years old.
Bismarck is absolutely shattered. He writes that the news of her death caused him to shed tears for the very first time since his traumatic childhood at the Playman Institute. The emotional dam breaks.
But his reaction to her death, the way he processes this grief, is strategically fascinating. Within mere weeks of Marie dying, Bismarck decides he needs to get married, and he sets his sights on Marie's closest friend, Johanna von Puttkamer.
But to marry Johanna, he has a massive obstacle. Johanna's father is a strict, deeply devout leader in the Pietist community. He knows Bismarck's reputation as a hard-drinking, cynical duelist.
So how does he get past the father?
To win the father's blessing, Bismarck sits down and writes the famous Werber-Brief, the suitor letter. It is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation and genuine emotional crisis.
In the letter, he masterfully spins his profound grief over Marie's death and his recent exposure to their Pietist circle into a compelling narrative of a sudden, miraculous spiritual awakening.
He explicitly claims that the tragedy drove him to his knees, and he prayed fervently for the first time in his adult life.
And the letter works. The father is moved by the idea of a saved sinner and gives his blessing.
But this raises a massive historical and psychological debate. Did Otto von Bismarck, the ultimate practitioner of ruthless realpolitik, actually find God? Was the conversion real?
That is one of the great debates among historians of Bismarck.
The eminent historian Otto Flans tackled this directly. Flans argues that Bismarck probably did find a version of God, but it was a very specific God, customized to fit Bismarck's own psychological needs.
Interesting. How so?
Religion gave Bismarck a sense of cosmic security. It gave him a powerful, supportive, infallible father figure in the sky, perfectly compensating for the weak biological father he despised.
But, and this is the crucial caveat, Flans notes that this newfound faith did not impart any actual Christian morality.
Exactly. Flans points out that while Bismarck adopted the rhetoric of faith, it never gave him an ounce of Christian charity, humility, or forgiveness.
He remained just as cynical, manipulative, and deeply hateful toward his political enemies as he was before.
If anything, he now believed that his own sheer will was aligned with the will of God, making him even more dangerous.
His conversion was, at best, a partial psychological coping mechanism, and at worst, a highly calculated piece of social utility to gain entry into a powerful network.
It's a very pragmatic view of faith.
It's as if he downloads the structure and the networking benefits of faith, but completely deletes the morality files before installing it.
That's a perfect analogy.
So he essentially marries the safe best friend on the rebound to stabilize his life. But in doing so, he inadvertently marries into the most powerful, right-wing, reactionary religious networking group in Prussia.
Precisely. And we must understand Johanna's specific role in this dynamic.
What was she like compared to Marie?
Johanna was not like Marie. She was plain, she was not particularly intellectual, she did not challenge him intellectually, and she was completely devoid of any societal or political ambition of her own.
Bismarck later coldly admitted in private that his wife had a narrow circle of interests.
Which sounds insulting, but for a man with a massive, fragile ego who hated strong women, it was exactly what he wanted.
Yes. She provided the utterly stable, undemanding, unconditionally supportive domestic background he craved.
She managed the estate and the children, creating a safe harbor. With his emotional life finally anchored, his debt settled, and his social status secured by the Pietist network, Bismarck was suddenly entirely free to unleash his massive, chaotic intellectual energy on the world stage.
And he unleashes it at the exact moment the world decides to catch fire. Because we are now entering the late 1840s, and the geopolitical and social realities of Europe are reaching a boiling point.
The late 1840s were a powder keg. We have to look at the socioeconomic pressures that had been building for decades since the end of the Napoleonic Wars.
What was going on?
The population of Europe, including Prussia, was booming due to rudimentary improvements in hygiene and a long period of peace. But the economy could not support them. Early industrialization was destroying traditional artisan guilds and displacing workers into crowded, unsanitary urban slums.
And then the agricultural system collapses. You have the devastating potato blight, the same one that caused the famine in Ireland sweeping across Europe, combined with severe grain crop failures. People are literally starving. The social pressure in the cities is explosive.
In 1847, King Friedrich William IV of Prussia is facing a crisis. He desperately needs to modernize the infrastructure. Specifically, he needs vast sums of money to build a national railroad network to move troops and goods.
But under the old laws, to raise new taxes or secure state loans, he has to get the approval of the provincial estates.
Exactly. So he reluctantly calls together the United Diet, a massive gathering of the regional parliaments in Berlin. But he explicitly refuses to grant them a real, modern constitution.
In his opening speech, he arrogantly tells the deputies, "I will never allow a written piece of paper to come between the Lord God and heaven in this land."
The king wants their money, but he refuses to share his divine power. The liberal deputies are furious.
Now, Bismarck desperately wants a seat at this diet. But incredibly, it's not because he has some grand vision for the railroad or national policy.
No, he manipulates his way into an alternate deputy seat for one incredibly petty, self-interested reason.
What was it?
There was a minor legal reform proposed at the Diet regarding the rights of peasants. Bismarck entered national politics specifically to protect his personal, feudal Junker right to hold private patrimonial courts on his own estate.
He wanted to maintain his medieval right to act as the literal judge and jury over his own tenant farmers, without interference from state lawyers.
It is the most hyper-local, self-interested entry into national politics imaginable.
It really is. But once he gets to Berlin and sits in that massive assembly hall, he discovers his true calling. On May 17, 1847, Bismarck gives his maiden speech to the Diet, and he intentionally decides to set the room on fire.
The context of the speech is crucial. The liberal deputies had been giving grand romantic speeches romanticizing the year 1813.
What happened in 1813?
That was the year the Prussian people rose up in a war of liberation to drive Napoleon's army out. The liberals claim that the people fought so bravely back then because they were promised a liberal constitution and civil rights, implying the king owed them now.
Bismarck stands up, a completely unknown rural deputy, and brutally mocks this sacred national myth.
He states that the idea that the Prussian people needed the promise of a constitution to fight is an insult to their honor. He says they fought simply because they hated the foreign French occupiers, not because they cared about liberal political theory.
The stenographic record of this moment is incredible. The entire Diet, hundreds of respected men, erupts in absolute outrage. They are screaming at him, hissing, demanding he sit down. The noise is deafening.
And what does Bismarck do in the face of this massive public hostility?
This is pure sociopathic coolness. While the crowd is screaming at him, Bismarck casually reaches into his pocket, pulls out a newspaper, unfolds it, and stands at the podium, quietly reading the paper.
He just waits, completely unbothered, until they exhaust themselves and quiet down, and then he finishes his speech.
It was pure, highly calculated political theater.
In that one moment, Bismarck realized a fundamental truth about modern politics. Extreme, unapologetic, reactionary behavior made him instantly famous.
He didn't care that the liberals hated him. He cared that the king's inner circle and the ultra-conservatives loved him for having the nerve to insult the liberals to their faces.
He became the immediate darling of the hard right, and he doubled down on this strategy shortly after by giving a highly publicized speech opposing the legal emancipation of Jewish citizens.
And again, tracking the historical text closely here, Bismarck leaned fully, unabashedly, into his inherited Junker prejudices.
He did. He stated publicly on the floor of the Diet that while he claimed to respect Jewish people personally, he would feel deeply depressed and humiliated if he ever had to obey a Jewish state official.
He didn't try to hide his bias behind legal arguments. He openly admitted his prejudices were, in his own words, sucked in with the mother's milk.
He is establishing himself as the absolute, uncompromising voice of the old, prejudiced feudal order.
But the problem for Bismarck is that the old order was about to physically collapse, because the calendar turns to 1848 and the socioeconomic powder keg finally ignites. Revolution hits the streets of Berlin.
It was a wave of revolutions that swept across Europe that spring. In Berlin, citizens threw up barricades in the streets, tearing up paving stones and overthrowing carts. The Prussian army, the pride of the Junkers, is ordered in to clear them, and brutal, bloody street fighting erupts.
Hundreds of civilians are killed. The pressure is immense.
And the absolute monarch, King Friedrich William IV, completely loses his nerve. He caves to the mob.
He orders his beloved army to withdraw from the city. He puts on an armband showing the revolutionary colors, and he issues a desperate proclamation addressed to my dear Berliners, promising a constitution, a parliament, and liberal reforms.
Bismarck, sitting out on his rural estate, is absolutely disgusted. He views the king's concession as a betrayal of everything Prussia stands for.
He doesn't want compromise. He wants a violent counter-revolution. He actually tries to arm his own peasant farmers with pitchforks and hunting muskets, proposing to march this ragtag militia on Berlin to rescue the king from the liberals.
The actual army generals have to intercept him and essentially tell him to go home and stop being ridiculous.
But Bismarck doesn't stop. He is buzzing with chaotic energy. He travels to the royal palace in Potsdam, sneaks in, and secures a secret meeting in a servant's room with Princess Augusta, the wife of the king's brother, who was next in line to the throne.
This meeting is a pivotal moment in his life. According to Augusta's own account, Bismarck tried to convince her to join a conspiracy.
What kind of conspiracy?
He wanted her to agree to use her young son's name, the future king, to launch a military counter-revolution against the sitting king's liberal concessions.
He is asking a princess to conspire against the reigning monarch. That is essentially high treason.
Augusta was horrified. She furiously refused his plan and ordered him out of the room.
And this exact moment cemented their lifelong mutual hatred.
Augusta saw Bismarck right then as a dangerous, unprincipled fanatic who would destroy the monarchy to save his own vision of it. And Bismarck never forgave her for rejecting his brilliant plan and exposing his treasonous overreach.
But wait, looking at all of this, his theatrical speeches, his backroom conspiracies, his manipulation of the press, there is a massive structural irony here.
What's the irony?
Bismarck absolutely hates the revolution. He hates the concept of parliaments, constitutions, and democracy. But isn't the revolution inadvertently proving that Bismarck is exactly the kind of brilliant, manipulative, media-savvy politician who is perfectly designed by nature to thrive in a modern parliamentary system?
That is the great defining paradox of Bismarck's entire early career. The 1848 revolution failed to create a true democracy, but it did force a permanent parliament and a constitution into existence. The absolute monarchy was dead.
The ultra-conservative Junkers realized they couldn't just rely on the king's divine right anymore. They needed a way to fight back within this new, modern legal framework. They needed a modern political ideology.
And they found the architect for that ideology in another incredibly ironic figure.
Yes, Friedrich Julius Stahl.
Exactly. Stahl was a brilliant legal scholar and a Jewish convert to Lutheranism. Ironically, this man with Jewish roots became the intellectual architect of the deeply anti-Semitic, reactionary Junker political party.
Stahl provided the complex constitutional theory that allowed conservatives to operate inside a parliament while still defending the king's ultimate authority.
Stahl provided the intellectual playbook, but Bismarck provided the ruthless execution.
Bismarck discovers that despite his hatred of the concept, he absolutely loves the reality of parliamentary politics.
He loved it. He loved the endless intrigue, the late-night backroom deals at the conservative club, the thrill of manipulating a hostile crowd with a speech, and the sheer power of his own intellect.
He realized a profound truth about the modern era. He didn't need to be an absolute monarch to rule a nation. He just needed a weak king, a chaotic, divided parliament, and his own unbreakable sovereign will.
And that profound realization brings us right back to the core premise we started with at the beginning of this deep dive.
Yeah, wrapping this all up.
We started by looking at a man who was, in his early years, deeply, fundamentally flawed. A bored, indebted, emotionally stunted, draft-dodging hypochondriac who failed miserably at his early career, alienated his peers, and shot pistols through windows just to cure his own boredom.
But by fusing his own massive, unresolved psychological needs, his desperate, lifelong search for a pliable surrogate father figure, his visceral hatred of strong women who reminded him of his mother, his desperate need for absolute control to soothe his hypochondria.
Yes, fusing all that with the rigid, militaristic, and hierarchical culture of the Prussian Junkers, he forged something entirely new in history.
He forged the sovereign self. He built an ego so massive, so politically astute, and so psychologically manipulative that it simply bypassed the need for traditional or legal authority.
It was a persona that allowed him to bend kings to his tears, paralyze parliaments with his rage, and eventually redraw the entire map of Europe to his will.
He didn't rule through the legal legitimacy of his office. He ruled through the terrifying, inescapable weight of his personality.
It really makes you think about how we frame the past. When you and I study history, We're usually taught to look at the massive, impersonal structural changes.
Right. We look at the demographic booms, the massive rise in agricultural productivity that ended the famines, the spread of the railroad networks, the macroeconomics of industrialization.
And those things absolutely matter. They set the stage. But the history detailed in these sources reminds us that the stage is still occupied by human beings.
History is irrevocably shaped by the deeply personal, messy, irrational, and often broken psychologies of individuals who simply possess the sheer force of will to refuse to be ignored.
It's a very sobering thought.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. If Otto von Bismarck's entire drive for absolute dominance, his relentless need to unify an empire, crush his political enemies, and master Europe, ultimately stemmed from a terrified 6-year-old's need to overcompensate for a weak father and an emotional absent mother, what does that say about the vast systems of power we live under today?
Are the grand geopolitical decisions, the wars, and the economic policies that shape our daily lives actually just the unpredictable fallout of our leaders' unresolved childhood family trauma playing out on a global stage?
It's a framework that makes the distant history we've discussed today feel deeply uncomfortably present.
It really does.
It is definitely something to think about the next time you look at the people currently running the world. That's all for this deep dive.